Welcome back to Just the Facts with me, Jill Wine-Banks. And today's special guest is really special because she is one of my dearest friends. I was actually her maid of honor. So that makes us really special. She's also very special because she is one of the smartest, most accomplished people I know in the whole world. You were, I think, the longest serving CEO of a Fortune company. Is that correct?
I was the longest serving female CEO
Yeah,
of a New York Stock Exchange company
right.
when I left, yes.
Exactly. So you're also, in my mind, an expert on many topics, but today we're going to talk about the endangered First Amendment. It is really scary to me what's happening in our country at universities, at protests, pretty much everywhere. The press is caving in and they are under constant attack. I can understand why they're caving in. But so let's start with some of that. You have the Department of Defense or the Department of War, which I will never say, but that's what some people are calling it who are not friends of ours, that they've banned certain outlets from even covering it, and they've set certain rules. You have a long history in fighting for the First Amendment. You are the sponsor of First Amendment awards and study it greatly. So could you comment on some of what is currently happening in our country to challenge the right to free speech?
Yes, and I certainly share your concern, although it is historically accurate to say that there have been other periods of time in which there have been serious assaults on First Amendment rights, particularly press and speech rights, certainly during the McCarthy-HUAC period. But before that, during the world wars, there's usually a backlash by government against war protesters. And it actually goes back even to the suspension of habeas corpus during the Civil War by Abraham Lincoln. So we historically have had kind of this tension between the ideals and the reality, which you could say is true of many of our constitutional
Yeah.
protections. That's we strive to become a more perfect union. We don't operate on the assumption that we were perfect from the beginning. Having said all of that, it's hard not to agree, Jill, with your premise, which is that there is a concerted, wholesale, highly strategic attack on our democratic institutions being led by the Trump administration. And it's an across the board kind of confluence of pressure tactics with litigation, with economic sanctions, with use and abuse of the media to foster an environment in which people incorrectly assume that their neighbor is their enemy and that they need to be deported or silenced. And so it becomes an environment in which it's especially critical that we call out that behavior and, frankly, that we support the institutions and individuals who are fighting to preserve those First Amendment values.
And that we punish the ones who are caving in. I
Mm.
mean, I know that some of the networks have lost viewership and schools have lost donations because they have caved in. Um, I'm a graduate of Columbia, which I'm ashamed of, but I'm also a former partner at Jenner and Block,
Jenner.
who I am very proud fought back and won. And they won because the Constitution is quite clear that this was a violation. You mentioned McCarthy. And I'm assuming that all of our viewers know what the McCarthy era was, but just in case you aren't, it goes back to the 50s and 60s and was a senator who started hearings and was punishing people that he accused without any evidence that they were communists, and it was awful. But now we have the President of the United States, not just a member of Congress, but we have the president who is leading the charge against the press, against universities. And that to me is a little bit more dangerous than it was even then. So we finally had some pushback against that. And as we've been talking about, there are obviously some pushback, but what's going on that we don't have everybody fighting this and realizing that it is, whether it's a peaceful protest or whether it's how you choose to educate people at a private university that is at risk here.
Well, I agree with you that the nature and level of the attacks coming literally out of the White House, and this is a White House, unlike the first Trump administration, that has really no guardrails on it based on people in the administration being prepared to say to this president, sir, that's not legal. Sir, that's not constitutional. Sir, that's not in the best interests of the country. Sir, that's not consistent with the oath you took. I mean, it's pretty clear that the primary qualification for service in this administration is a kind of absolute blind loyalty above any qualifications for jobs that people hold. So it's a alarming dynamic that's out there right now. However, maybe because I'm an eternal optimist, do think
Yes,
that
you are.
I am, yes. Do think that increasingly more and more people who might not be thinking of themselves as progressives or as Democrats or even as necessarily opponents to all of Trump's policies are starting to understand the dangerous consequences of the policies that we're talking about are. And I think it often comes down to kind of whose ox is gored. So there is a general sense of, I'm not for censorship, but, and then the person saying that fills in whatever it is that they find most alarming and therefore most in need of being suppressed. And that goes across the political spectrum. We have to be honest here. That
Yes.
comes from the left as well as from the right. Um, and when it starts to seem as if your set of community values are also being assaulted, or when, for example, you're concerned about anti-Semitism on campuses, but you start to see that that is being used as a ruse to simply suppress freedom of academic
Yeah.
discourse and student protest on universities, then I think you start to see more and more support for pushing back. And I think we're seeing that at the federal court level in the
Yes.
main. Obviously, you are an expert on the courts, but I think you and I share a worry about this Supreme Court and what it will do, what it already has done. But in general, I think the federal courts have been pretty good about pushing back. And I think that organizations like the ACLU or like FIRE are finding that there is popular support for standing up against the both legal and financial bullying by the administration.
So you've mentioned a couple things that I want to follow up on. I'll do fire second, but first you
Uh-huh.
mentioned censorship, and I we have book bannings that are really scary. We have self-censorship. I've
Yes.
even self-censored myself. I'm writing a teen book, and I have avoided using the word gender. It's not relevant to my story. It's not essential, but I am deliberately not using it because I don't want to be banned. And I
Mhm.
shouldn't have to worry about book banning. It's also happening in museums where
Yes.
the current U.S. attorney for the Eastern District of Virginia, her job before that was working in the White House to cleanse the Smithsonian of any references that might cause Donald Trump to feel uncomfortable, any references to the fact that we were a slave economy. All of
It is,
those
I have
things.
to interrupt, so ironic that this president, this administration has been engaged in a what they would call a war on woke, has expressed for themselves the extreme kind of fragility about don't hurt my feelings, don't say something that makes me feel bad, that they seem to relish attacking in others.
Yeah. It's very scary, but it's also rewriting history. That's what's happening, is that
Right.
children were they're going to grow up thinking that we were always what we are now, and that just isn't our history. But you know that that is a separate and horrible issue. But you also mentioned FIRE, and that's not an organization that I think many people are familiar with. So you're involved in, aside from the Playboy Foundation doing First Amendment awards, FIRE, CAP, the Center for American Progress.
Mhm,
And let's see, you had another, oh, News Literacy Project. And
mhm.
I would like to familiarize our audience with those organizations because I think that that is something that can give comfort and that you can sign up to get announcements from and learn
Yes.
what's going on. So if you would describe those, particularly FIRE and News Literacy, which is a very valuable tool.
Absolutely, and you're quite right in saying that these are wonderful resources for information, and I'm gonna add
Yeah.
one more, which is called NewsGuard. But
Yes.
they're also, I wanna say, worthy of support, in the way that it's important both as a matter of moving the direction of the country, but also as a matter of self-empowerment to feel like there are actions we can take that are making a difference. So,
Hmm.
FIRE is the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. And it was started back in '99, and they focused initially and still do quite a bit around free expression issues on campuses. Were campuses allowing diverse opinions to be expressed? And in fact, they would often take on organizations on campuses that would disinvite conservative speakers from
Yes.
liberal campuses or would lobby to uh, get a honorary degree rescinded from someone
Mm.
who had been, let's say, Condoleezza Rice would be an example, who had been in an administration that not all liberals approved of all their policies, but that doesn't really justify not honoring
Right.
someone that went through a process that was vetted. And so they do rankings of universities and colleges around these issues, including asking the students themselves, do they feel free in a classroom to express a point of view that's different than what they think the majority of the fellow students think, to your point about self-censorship.
Right.
Now they've become even more aggressive in protecting the rights of protesters on universities, and they filed a very important lawsuit um, that is basically a First Amendment lawsuit that says because someone's here on a student visa from another country and they're protesting the war in Gaza or the Trump administration, they haven't lost their First Amendment rights because they're here on a student visa. Those rights are here for the people who are here in this country. So they're involved in that lawsuit. They won the lawsuit defending the pollster in the Des Moines Register whose
Yes.
poll showed that Trump was farther behind than the results demonstrated. A very well respected pollster, and yes, polls don't get everything right, and frankly, it's harder to poll accurately when people don't have landlines and they don't want to answer questionnaires. They won that lawsuit, and they work a lot around these issues of where can we, through the courts, protect rights that are otherwise under attack. And so I'm a big fan. They get about 1,500 requests to intervene a year. They get involved in about
Wow.
400 cases. Um, so they're absolutely both a resource and worth supporting. They came out of a really interesting book that the founder, Greg Lukianoff, co-authored called The Coddling of the American Mind, which was published in 2015 and actually won the HMH First Amendment Award that was given that year for book publishing. It's well worth reading because it really was prescient about this sort of generational shift towards needing safe spaces, needing
Yeah.
trigger warnings, needing to be protected from ideas, not actions, but ideas that might make people uncomfortable. And so much of that trend is now playing out in a larger arena in which people are in need of being reminded that the First Amendment is there to protect unpopular points of view.
Right.
Popular points of view will do just fine in the marketplace of ideas. So I do think FIRE is a really important organization, and a lot
Yeah.
of people who you know, Jill, like Nadine Strassen
Right.
and Bob Corn Revere, are very engaged with them.
Right. And you and I both grew up in an era where there was discussion and even compromise between people of very opposing viewpoints. You could have a civil discussion and try to understand the other perspective and maybe reach a place where both of you were comfortable. That's something that is long
Well, and it
gone.
starts with, to be not too philosophical or psychological about it, it starts with a certain amount of humility that
Yes.
requires all of us to say, I may not be right about all things, and I'd like to hear different points of view on things because that will help me come to my best thinking about often complex issues. And frankly, then to make my best case if I'm trying to persuade others. And I think too often now people seek out not information, but affirmation. And that's not
Yes.
healthy.
And I think the other thing is it's a question of delving into facts and accepting what is fact. And that brings us, I think, to NewsGuard,
Yes.
who does something. So why don't you talk a little bit about NewsGuard so that everybody knows how they can access that help?
Yeah, it's a terrific organization that was started, oh, I guess about 7 years ago by 2 people I know in the world of journalism. A man named Gordon Kravitz, who was executive editor of the Wall Street Journal, and a man named Stephen Brill, who you might know
Oh,
because
I
he
know him
launched
very well. Yeah.
yeah, um, launched the first cable channel
Court
dedicated to
TV.
24-hour coverage of trials, and has gone on to write a number of books and a number of articles. And they were, back then already very concerned about the dissemination of both misinformation and disinformation,
Yeah.
which, as you know, Jill, are two different things. So misinformation is someone is reporting on or forwarding information that's wrong, but they're doing it out of ignorance. Disinformation is the intentional
Yeah.
distribution of misleading information, and that is done a lot by bots and a lot by foreign governments. So what NewsGuard does is it employs journalists who look at thousands of news entities, websites, um, apps, um, AI generated material, and it ranks them based on how good a job they are doing at presenting information responsibly, having a mechanism for correcting errors, actually distinguishing between news and opinion, avoiding deceptive headlines, disclosing who owns the website and where their money comes from, and doesn't repeatedly publish false information because, yes, journalists are people and they will sometimes get it wrong. But if they're consistently publishing that, and then they put all that information out there for those of us that are trying to judge whether the places we go for information are reliable or not. So you can get both sort of assessments of all different websites and apps for information, but they'll also put out stories all the time about this story went viral and it's wrong, and here's what's wrong about it. They had a story today about the fact that there's been a concerted effort for some time now coming out of Russia to present Ukrainian soldiers as no longer wanting to fight. So there
Oh,
were videos that went out of Ukrainian soldiers crying and begging to be let out of the service, or of marches of Ukrainian soldiers begging forgiveness for fighting against Russia. And of course, it was all not true. And they can dissect why that's not true and deconstruct why it's not true. So I'm a fan of theirs. Much of their information is free, so you should certainly use it to
yeah.
evaluate any site you go to. But it also, if you have the means, it's worth subscribing to because they operate as a nonprofit in the public interest.
And of course, you've given me the perfect segue to mention my sister-in-law from hashtag sisters-in-law, Barb McQuaid's book, which is Attack from Within, which
Mm.
is focused on dis and misinformation and what to do about it and how it is hurting America. So a plug for Barb's book
And
seems
actually, one of the executive editors for NewsGuard is a distinguished Chicago journalist, Jim Warren, who would, I think, make an interesting guest for you at some point.
okay. Well, then we'll have to get his contact information from you.
I'd be happy to do that.
And you also mentioned the News Literacy Project
Yes.
that I think is a really another great thing that I would like people to know about.
And I know you've actually had conversations with Alan Miller,
Yeah.
who was the
Yeah.
founder, Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, who I met when he was at the LA Times. And their focus is really on classroom learning, and that as important as learning history and civics and a lot of things that
Yeah.
we don't teach very well anymore, in this world that we live in today, where it's no longer 3 television networks and a handful of
Right.
newspapers and magazines, but bloggers and bot-created content, it's really important as a life skill to teach literally news literacy. So they've put together all kinds of modules of curriculum around how do you figure out what the source is, how do you double check the information that's been presented, what's the difference between opinion and news, what does the First Amendment mean? And those uh, modules are taught in classrooms starting in grammar school age
Right.
in public schools, both here in Illinois and across the country. They've done some work that's for the broader audience of those of us that are just citizens that want to be skilled in terms of how to navigate this world. And I think that's helpful, and you can actually sign up for that, and that's also free. Although, again, I think it's worthy of our support, just the way I feel it's important we all pay for content itself. As I
Yeah.
like to remind people, we all pay for Netflix. We should pay for our news too.
I completely agree. And they are a really um, exciting and interesting and helpful tool to use. I think children in school, starting in grade school, need to learn critical thinking skills. That's
Yes.
not critical race theory. I didn't say that. I said critical thinking skills. And
Right.
that means being able to analyze, is it too good to be true? Because it probably isn't true if you think it's too good to be true. Is it just confirming what I already believe? Is there another perspective? I think those are really important things that we need to survive in this world. And again, it gets back to the reason I started this show, just the facts, is
Yes.
because I think facts are essential for our democracy to continue to survive. And as you mentioned, in the marketplace of ideas, the truth is supposed to emerge. But if you are only listening to Fox News, to point out one possible source, you will not get the facts.
Right.
When I talk about something, I've read the indictment. I don't just take someone's report on the indictment. I delve into the underlying documents so that I know that what I'm saying is based on fact. Whereas I talk to people who listen to Fox and they'll go, "Well, I don't believe that," and then you're in real trouble. So
No, it's so true. And that's why I think exactly as you said, Jill, that the combination of critical thinking skills with knowing what sources are reliable is our best
right,
defense against the
yeah.
algorithms.
And then okay, so we also have there is, because of the attacks on the news, and Donald Trump is famous for his, you're a liar, you're fake news, get out of here, look at all those people in the back of the room, get rid of them. Um, Local news is still more believed than national news. And there are
Yes.
some really good organizations in the Chicago area and probably nationwide that are still trusted. And I think that's something that's worth our pursuing, and making sure that people are aware of the state's news services that will give you that information that you can rely on. And you've been involved with them as well. I mean, if we go through everything you're involved in, we're never going to finish this show. And actually, I mean, I have so many subjects besides the First Amendment that I'm hoping I can persuade you to come back to talk about. Oh, women's rights, gerrymandering, which you've been a long activist in, and the National Compact, Voters Compact, and some of the other things, fair map activities. But let's stick with First Amendment for today, because we have
Right.
plenty to talk about there. Um, and how do we deal with things like self-censorship? How do we deal with book banning? How do we fight back to make sure that um, today's children will get to read? I mean, they're banning the most amazing books you could imagine that have really just points of view that may support for example, um, same-sex marriage.
Mhm.
And you don't have to let your child read it, but you can't take it out of libraries, but that's
Right.
what's happening. So what's the answer to that? What can people listening to this show who I'm if you're listening, you're on our side. I know it. You're not reading Fox and you're paying attention to this. What activities can they do to make sure that children's libraries continue to have books available to them?
Well, without injecting capital P politics
Yeah.
into what really should be a completely nonpartisan discussion, because there shouldn't be any partisanship associated
Right.
with the First Amendment. However, um, the reality is that there is, and one thing that we all need to do is do something that is hard to do, but so important, and that is pay attention to down ballot races like school board and library
Yes.
board races, because often where the rubber meets the road is in the libraries and in the classrooms, and who sits on those school boards and library boards is just critical. And in fact, I have to say that going back way before Donald Trump was anything other than a real estate developer who didn't pay his bills, there were organized efforts to take over school boards and organized efforts to take over library boards that we had to play catch up on.
Yes.
But that's one thing I would say that's really, really important, because when I was launching the First Amendment Awards, one of the things that I got educated on, having had this Music Man image of Marion the librarian as this kind of square person, who was, not really cool at all, was that you want to talk about who's in the trenches on these issues, it's
Yeah.
librarians. And they are the ones that won't release, the list of who checked out a book, or will, testify in front of a school board about why removing the book is the wrong thing to do. So elections matter. And it's not just, although, gosh, with the midterms coming up, we could certainly talk about that election, but these other elections really, really
Yeah.
matter.
And, a couple things just struck me when I was listening to your answer. One is we actually had some interaction before we actually met, long before we became friends. I was general counsel of the Army. You were the
Mhm.
CEO of Playboy, and Playboy was banned at the
Right.
Army and Air Force stores. And of course, that's a great audience for Playboy magazine. They're the right age group, the right in general. Most of the service is still made up of men, although women now are a large part of it and an essential part. That's a
Yeah.
whole nother subject we could talk about. Um, and you had someone come to me to make a legal presentation about why that was a violation of the First Amendment. And I assigned it to one of my staff who did a research and said, yeah, it really is. And I had to take on the chaplain of the Army and the general counsel of the Air Force, because it was a joint, it's the AFIS, the Army Air Force stores. And we managed to get Playboy sold again in the store. And then I met you years later when I moved to Chicago. So just a small world. It's
Well,
really
and
strange.
it's really interesting. You were talking about sort of history. Um, Playboy published a lot of articles questioning the wisdom of the war in Vietnam. And in fact, when John Kerry gave what became a very famous testimony in front of Congress, in which he said, as a veteran, how are you going to be, how are you going to ask the last man to die in Vietnam when you say the war is a
Yeah.
mistake, was published in Playboy. And a
Oh,
lot of returning veterans from Vietnam would say that they learned more about what was actually going on
wow.
and over there, because they were reading Playboy, because they weren't getting broadcast news, and they weren't getting, um, Seymour Hersh's,
Right.
investigative reporting. So it all kind of becomes of a piece in terms of giving people the accurate information to take personal and political positions.
Yeah. Of course, that reminds me that I recently asked you if you had seen a TV series called Minx, which
Right.
is
I haven't
a
yet.
female version of Playboy. And where the articles are very progressive in terms of women's rights, and it's set in the 70s, so it's what was then the women's lib movement,
Mhm.
um, and had high quality articles that eventually, of course, all the major publishers wanted to publish. But anyway, hopefully you'll see that someday too.
Oh, but because
Um,
you asked about, libraries, I haven't seen it yet, since you're talking about, video entertainment, but there's a award-winning, terrific, documentary that I think is now available called Librarians
oh,
that I definitely can recommend based on what people I trust have told me about it and that I'm looking forward to seeing. So
excellent. Well, let's see it together. And one of my favorite aunts was a librarian, and I always admired her for that. I thought that was great. All right, so maybe one last question to wrap up before we run
mhm.
out of time. And that is, we both are in the Chicago area and both are experiencing, well, the departure soon of the Guard, which was never deployed. They were nationalized and sent here, but they were never allowed on our streets because of lawsuits. Um, but we are witnessing some of the most egregious violations of the First Amendment and many other amendments, which we could go into in terms of the punishment of immigrants, the punishment of the people supporting the immigrants, American citizens being pulled from their cars and beaten because they're trying to draw attention to the fact that ICE is in the neighborhood. Um, the gassing and pepper spraying of um, our, well, of Daniel Biss, the mayor of Evanston, who is our favorite candidate for Congress right now for
I was just
replacing
with him
Jan
today at
Schakowsky.
the annual J
Oh,
Street lunch. Yeah.
okay. All right. Well, there you go. Um, so, what do we say to protesters? What do we say? Do we need to keep going to court to say, and the court has already said, you cannot uh, pepper spray peaceful protesters, but
Right.
they're doing it anyway. What do we do
Yes, well, these
now?
are we absolutely have to keep saying it, and yes, there is gonna have to continue to be legal action by groups like the ACLU, like
Yeah.
FIRE. I think it's very important. But what's also very important is something, Jill, you alluded to a moment ago, which is, supporting the local news organizations
Yes.
that are providing coverage of these protests and the actions in a way in which, because the major newspapers, even though we still have 2, have been so severely cut back in terms of their editorial resources that we need eyes on the street. So people like Block Club,
Yes.
people like ProPublica, people like the Invisible Institute, your own, because you're on the board, the BGA,
Yes.
people like the Reader.
The reader.
We
Yeah.
need alternative sources of information that illuminate these egregious and illegal actions so that people can mobilize, whether it's to mobilize as a protest with their whistles or to mobilize behind support for organizations that are filing litigation. So the other kind of call to action, in addition to supporting the organizations, is to really support the media outlets, either directly or through Press Forward, which aggregates donations to nonprofit local journalism, both here and there are chapters all around the country.
And I'm wearing a resistance pin, which is a paperclip, which was used in World War II in Norway to show that you were part of the resistance. I had
Ah,
the pin made not only because I am known for my pins, but because I was wearing a paperclip and it doesn't really show up that well. And I wanted people to say, "Oh, why are you wearing a paperclip?"
yes.
And to be able to say, because I'm part of the resistance and you
Right.
should be too. I also carry a whistle with me at all times. I had a pin made out of a whistle, an actual whistle, but it's easier to wear it on
I had
a
friends tell
lanyard.
me that when they took children or grandchildren trick or treating on Halloween, sometimes people will just put out, a basket of candy on
Right.
the porch. They'll decorate and stuff. That in a number of places there was one basket of candy for the kids and there was a basket of whistles for the adults.
Oh my gosh, what a great I wish I
Right?
had
How
thought of
cool is
that.
that?
That
Yeah.
is I actually was walking not far from where you are, and there were people on the street handing out whistles and trying to call attention to this is what you can do in terms of
Right.
staying alert and helping your community. And of course, I live in a town that is extremely
Yeah.
progressive and that has one of the worst episodes happened not far from where I live in terms of people using whistles and
Yeah.
following in a car that ended up ICE deliberately made it crash. And then they pulled the person out of the car and beat him up and tied him up, what do you call it? The zip tied him.
Oh,
Um,
yeah.
and on Halloween night, there is some video from Skokie, not far from me, of a mother saying, please get out of my neighborhood. You are terrorizing my children who want to go trick or treating, because there were more than half dozen armed, camouflaged, masked ICE
The
agents.
fact that they're allowed to wear masks to me is just
Yes.
horrifying.
Well,
Yeah.
they aren't technically. They're supposed to in Chicago anyway. They
Right.
aren't allowed to wear masks, but that hasn't stopped them. It's horrible. And what they've done in Broadview is horrible. A class action is now proceeding against conditions in the detention center it's
I
outside of
saw that.
Chicago, but yeah.
You know,
So
I'll end on one other, note of what we can do, and I don't take credit for this. Someone sent me, an email that was an update that caused me to take action, and it was focused around the terrible actions that were going on in Little Village. And of course,
yes,
what was happening as a consequence was that the local businesses have been decimated because people are afraid to go out. And the woman who wrote to me and has a email list was saying that she went to one of her favorite local, very casual restaurants that normally would be packed, and it was
oh,
empty because of that. And asking people to go eat in these neighborhoods. And so Arthur and I, with friends, went down to Little Village and ate at this restaurant, which is just a super casual restaurant, but actually had terrific food. So sometimes you can actually sort of vote with your pocketbook in neighborhoods that are where the businesses are just being decimated.
that is a great idea to end on. And I am going to plan to go to some of the neighborhoods that have been hurt by this. And Chicago, I'm only hoping that ICE, which has said they're leaving,
Right.
um, only because they're going to go terrorize some other place. And I have said on this show often that what we're seeing here is what you may see in your neighborhood. And so don't take it lightly and protest now because, what was that famous saying? First, they came for the labor activists, and I wasn't one, so I did nothing. And by the time they came for me,
There
there
was
was
no
no
one
one to
left.
protect me.
Yeah.
So let's protect our neighbors. Let's protect the people. These are not criminals. Yes, they may have come here without legal documentation, but they have committed no crimes in our country. They aren't the worst of the worst.
Right.
Thank you, Christie, so much. And I do
A
hope you'll come
pleasure.
back and talk about some of these other subjects. It's been a
I would
pleasure.
be happy to. Thank you, Jill.
Thank you.